High-profile visits and multi-million-dollar arms deals. U.S. policy on Bahrain has been in marked contrast to other flashpoints in the Arab Spring. A year on from the revolt's beginning, is the U.S. guilty of hypocrisy? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Lisa Fletcher. Maintain power through consent, not coercion, was U.S. President Barack Obama's message to Arab leaders as he laid out his vision of democracy for the Middle East 2 years ago in Cairo. But then came a wave of uprisings across the Arab world. Uprisings that have left the U.S. president under pressure to live up to the standards he established. Perhaps nowhere is more emblematic of U.S. inconsistencies in the region as Bahrain. The tiny Gulf state saw an eruption of anti-government protests and a violent crackdown that began exactly 1 year ago. But after strongly supporting democracy movements in Tunisia and Egypt, the language and actions from Washington toward Bahrain were markedly toned down. Washington has huge strategic ties to Bahrain. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet has its base there, part of the U.S. effort to counter nearby Iran's influence in the region. And Bahrain's deadly crackdown did not prevent the U.S. from pursuing a much criticized $53 million arms deal with Bahrain's autocratic government. Though under pressure from Americans and the Congress, it has now suspended the sale. However, at a time when Washington has heavily criticized Russia and China for looking after its own interests in violence-torn Syria, is the U.S. guilty of the same in Bahrain? Rosalind Jordan has this from the State Department.
Washington has tried to avoid using what's called a cookie-cutter approach to the uprisings during the Arab Spring. But so far, the U.S. has not used much of its considerable leverage when it comes to the matter of Bahrain. The Pentagon in mid-2011 ruled out the possibility of relocating the Fifth Fleet naval headquarters. And while a $53 million arms deal is on hold because of human rights concerns, the U.S. has delivered some other smaller parts that were part of previous arms deals.
It's important to give credit to the Bahraini government for what they've done.
But is it enough?
Well, the only long-term solution in Bahrain is a genuine dialogue that leads to national reconciliation. And that requires both the government and the opposition to come to the table in good faith.
The U.S. has also criticized the opposition for not making enough of an effort to engage in constructive dialogue with the kingdom.
Various segments of Bahraini society have chosen sort of rejectionism and violence over trying to have this sort of positive agenda for reform and change.
Bahrain's strategic importance did influence the U.S.'s response to last year's crackdown. But without using stronger language or more of its political and military leverage, critics say the U.S. may be breaking the very compact it says it forged with the peoples of the region.
Is the U.S. guilty of hypocrisy regarding the Bahrain protests? With me to discuss this is Michael Singh, the managing director of the Washington Institute and former senior director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. Next to him, Brian Dooley, director of the Human Rights Defenders Program at Human Rights First, and also Francois Seznec, visiting associate professor at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Michael Singh, I want to start with you. Popular protests continue almost daily in Bahrain, often met with police violence. Bring us up to speed on what's happening today in Bahrain and if anything has improved in the last year.
Well, the situation right now is sort of unfolding as we speak, but there have been a lot of expectations that there will be violence on this day in particular, this being the anniversary of the uprising, beginning in Pearl Square, which of course now has been demolished. The latest reports I've seen are that there have been clashes between the police and protesters, some tear gas fired, some heavy artillery, or not artillery, but heavy vehicles on their way down to the area where the protests are occurring. But so far it looks like perhaps not so much violence, as though the violence has not really broken out in the way that people had feared, which is a good thing.
So this is the 1 year anniversary. Have we made any progress?
Well, I think from the U.S. perspective, as far as the U.S. government looks at it, they do believe that the government of Bahrain has made an effort. There has been this International Commission of Inquiry, which was I think, a genuine effort on the part of the monarchy to take a look at what happened. However, there are a lot of things which aren't quite so satisfactory. I think the United States would like the Bahraini monarchy to move faster, to accelerate the political reform process. I think they'd like political prisoners, those who are in prison for expression, to be released from prison or to have their cases reviewed. And I think they'd just like to see more dialogue taking place between the opposition and the monarchy right now. And frankly, none of that is terribly satisfactory. And I think unless we see more of that, we can expect more clashes and violence.
Brian Dooley, the report that Michael Singh is referring to did outline the abuses going on in Bahrain. Did that report go far enough?
It wasn't a whitewash. The Bahrain government commissioned that report, although ourselves and other leading human rights organisations in the world had been telling the Bahrain government for months what had been happening in its country, as did Al Jazeera and other international media organisations. Nonetheless, the Bahrain government felt the need to commission its own its own panel of experts, and they more or less corroborated what we've been saying, that thousands of people had been arrested, thousands more had been dismissed from their jobs, many people have been tortured into confessing crimes that they had not committed, and that the whole process of pushing civilians through military courts was deeply flawed and unfair. So the report was pretty good in some places, it wasn't perfect, but nonetheless a decent starting point for the Bahrain government, if it really wanted to reform and make progress on human rights, to start with as a plan to make some advances. It doesn't really seem to have done that very much.
Sean, Francois Seznec, is there a pathway within that report for the Bahraini government to get to a more reasonable place with the opposition?
Yes, I think there would be very much that possibility, but the decisions would have to be very difficult. I think one of the key issues would be to have a new government, a government of national unity that would include both Sunnis and Shia, that would decide to maybe replace the prime minister, that would also make sure that the armed forces and the police forces are integrated, because they are now 99% Sunni oppressing the Shia, or seen as oppressing the Shia. So there are a lot of things to do. Another issue of importance is the elections. The elections are pretty much flawed in the sense that it's gerrymandered in such a way that there's always a majority Sunni, but the Shia claims they're a majority, but that is also difficult because the Sunnis also are claiming to be a majority these days. So to clarify all this, these decisions have to be made to clarify the situation with this national unity government, which I think would help a lot.
Okay, I want to take a closer look at the protests in Bahrain and what the human rights groups are actually saying. At least 35 people were killed between February and April last year, according to the independent commission appointed by the Bahraini government. The commission said security forces were responsible for more than half of the deaths. The report also said that several detainees were tortured. Amnesty International says at least another 20 people have been killed since then. Human rights groups say security forces continue to use excessive force. They have called on Bahrain to release political prisoners and investigate ranking security officials. Brian, does the U.S. have a responsibility to intervene and to stem the violence and the human rights abuses that are going on?
Well, the U.S. absolutely has a responsibility to speak out more clearly and more often than it has done. If we look at what progress has been made, it's been largely cosmetic. The Bahrain government has issued some reports, it's brought in some high-profile consultants, it's made many promises about what it's going to do. But if you look at the situation, what's happening is the police is still using excessive force, I mean, even since the Bassiouni report. And I think just as tellingly, it is still pressing charges against people who have been convicted by the military court and by the civilian courts too, really for just expressing their peaceful views. So within the next week, we have a former member of parliament, Matar, another leader of civil society, Mahdi Abu Deeb, the teachers' union president. These guys have been prosecuted for peacefully expressing their views, and those charges aren't being dropped. So no matter what the rhetoric that the Bahraini government makes about how it's progressing, it's turned a new leaf on human rights, these are the real indicators. The week after that, on February the 27th, 20 Bahraini doctors are back in court. Very famous case. They really are being prosecuted because they They treated injured protesters, and then they told Al Jazeera and other people what was happening. So until we get some real progress on cases like those and hundreds of others, I think all the claims to be sincere about wanting a new chapter in human rights sound very hollow.
Jean-Francois?
Yeah. Yes, there's a new narrative being sold by the Bahraini government at this time, by the Al Khalifa family in particular, that the Sunnis and certain groups within the Sunnis are pushing very hard to have no accommodation with the Shia, and to make sure that they get punished to the full extent of the military law. So they're now showing, or the Al Khalifas are trying to argue, that they are really the neutral party, and it's not easy for them to go against half of the population and against the other half of the population. So we don't know exactly where this is going, but that's the excuse for not really making any real reforms.
What we're talking about is the U.S. acting in a hypocritical manner in terms of how it is handling itself with what's going on in Bahrain.
Yes, it is.
Well, look, I think it's unfair to say that this is hypocrisy by the United States, because one thing which I think a lot of us have observed since the beginning of these Arab uprisings last year is that these, just because we have uprisings across the Middle East, does not mean they're all the same and need to be treated the same. This isn't Syria, this isn't Libya, certainly. That doesn't mean that what's happening isn't of great concern. And the United States has indeed been speaking out. I think just in the last couple of weeks, we've had the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights talking about those political prisoners and the need to release them from prison, to pardon them for crimes related to political expression, which we don't find acceptable. The State Department spokesman has said the same thing. I think what's very difficult for the United States in this scenario is that our influence with these Gulf leaders I think has been eroding in the couple of years that preceded the Arab Spring. And so when these uprisings took place, and particularly this one in Bahrain, we weren't in the best position as the United States to have influence. And I think that the way that the Obama administration has tried to approach the situation in Bahrain is as an ally and a friend, to try to push for reform, to try to push for the right decisions from the monarchy. But frankly, they haven't had great success doing that. The Saudis have had more success with the Bahrainis because frankly, I think right now that's the closer relationship.
Yes, I believe, though, that the Saudis are really the key to this issue, because some people will argue that Bahrain is already the 13th province of Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. government is really following the Saudi leadership. There is this whole view that any power by the Shia in Bahrain would be just a way for the Iranians to enter the region. And the Saudis are vastly opposed to that, and I think we are opposed to that as well. So we mealy mouth our support of democracy, but the fact is we are very happy to have the Saudis in control and just fight the Shia because we don't want them to be a door to Iran.
Well, let's talk about the U.S. military relationship, because our relationship with Bahrain stretches back to 1949. Those ties were expanded soon after the 1991 Gulf War, when an agreement granted U.S. forces access to Bahraini facilities and allowed them to store arms and equipment there for future conflicts. In 1995, Bahrain became the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. The U.S. designated Bahrain as a major non-NATO ally in March of 2002. And the U.S. has sold arms worth $1.4 billion to Bahrain since 2000. They include Apache and Cobra attack helicopters, F-16 warplanes, missile launchers and howitzers, plus more than 50 Abrams tanks. More than 6,000 U.S. troops and contractors are now based in Bahrain. So the U.S. says it's committed to human rights and these universal values, but when those rights come in conflict with what is domestically at its political best interests, do we see this U.S. hypocrisy bear itself?
I'm not sure that that isn't a false choice between backing a dictatorship and having a strong military tie with the government. I mean, look what happened elsewhere in the Middle East. The US was backing the wrong horses in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere for a long time in the name of stability. And we've seen within the last year just how unstable those dictatorships are, in fact. So what the US is in the best interest of the US really is predictability and stability in Bahrain. And I don't think that supporting the monarchy there is really the best way to ensure that. You don't have a stable government there now. It's a very volatile, fragile situation. The protests aren't going away. People are demanding some degree of democracy. And let's just remember what the Bahraini system of government is. Right? There's a king who stacks his cabinet at any one time with members of his family. More than half the cabinet are members of his family. His uncle has been the unelected Prime Minister of Bahrain for 41 years, since the first Nixon administration. He can change the constitution when he likes. So the idea about elections, yeah, some elections happen, but they're pretty token and they're very gerrymandered. So if the US really thinks it's in its best interest to back yet another dictator who at times look very wobbly, then I think that's a very misguided analysis.
You know, the big picture here is important. The big picture, I think, for the United States is that we are very concerned about Iran right across the Gulf. And there is a region-wide effort by the United States to really bolster our allies in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in the United Arab Emirates, and in Bahrain. But it's important to note that the U.S. arms sales to Bahrain have been suspended for this time, which is quite a significant step for the United States, considering that we're selling a great deal of arms to all those countries in the region, including Egypt. We've just seen in the president's new budget that maintains $1.3 billion in arms sales to Egypt, a country where we've seen Muslim Brotherhood successes, for example.
But if the Obama administration would have been left to its own devices and there weren't protests from human rights groups and members of Congress didn't stand up and sharply criticize the president, would that $53 million sale have gone through?
Absolutely, and another $1 million of transfers is going through.
Look, I think that that's not right. I think that the U.S. interest in democracy and in reform is genuine. This is not a new phenomenon. This predated the Arab Spring, in fact. And I think that what the United States feels about what's happening in a place like Bahrain is that we're not following a Saudi line or anything like that. In fact, there have been great tensions with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states over this because they find our position to be unacceptable because they do see the Shia as perhaps a door for Iran and Iranian influence in the region.
But I think that's where the weakness, that's exactly the weakness of the U.S. position, because ultimately, as Brian said, if we keep supporting the Sunnis against the Shia, we are opening the door to Iran. But by and large, and my experience from living in Bahrain, traveling to Bahrain, is that the Shia view themselves as Bahraini, not an Arab. They view themselves as Arab Bahrainis, not as Iranian Shia. And therefore, if we could have a government or an entity that is really Bahraini with support of the Shia, that would be very much a rampart against Iran.
Look,
at this point,
we're
opening the door.
As well. And to be clear, I don't think what you have from the U.S. is support for the Sunni against the Shia. I think the U.S. view is that the United States is very dismayed to see sectarianism breaking out in Bahrain and to see sectarian divide sharpening, because it's that which will open the door to Iranian influence. If really the Shia in Bahrain feel as though the United States isn't going to support them, as though the international community isn't going to support them, then we risk pushing them into the arms, I think, of Iran. And this is a place where, frankly, the United States and some of our allies in the Gulf have disagreed. So I do think it's important to keep in mind that the United States policy here is one of pushing for reform and of ensuring that we're holding the Bahraini monarchy to some sort of account on this. Now, I think that we could be doing more, and I think that certainly the monarchy could be doing more.
Well, it looks very unconvincing, let me tell you, to Bahraini activists who speak to me that the US is pushing hard for reform. They don't see that at all. They see long periods of silence from the US, not supporting them. Instead, they see the US intending to or actually doing military transfers on a large scale to Bahrain. The dilemma for the US here is, when it talks about a strategic interest and alliance with Bahrain, what does it mean? Does it mean with that royal ruling family, or does it mean with the vast majority of people in Bahrain who are looking for democracy? The problem for the people who are looking for democracy, who I listen to, is that they see the US really as putting all its eggs in the basket of being in cahoots with the dictatorship. And I think that the US has lost credibility over the last year with the democracy activists who it absolutely ought to be supporting.
The funny thing, Brian, is that today the Sunnis, the Sunni brothers who are very powerful in Bahrain, are really opposed to the U.S. because they view the U.S. as being stooges of the opposition, of the Shia opposition, and vice versa. The Shia opposition thinks we're doing too nice to the Al-Khalifas in particular. So the Al-Khalifas are taking advantage of this situation to say, well, we're just trying to keep stability between the extremist Sunnis and the extremist Shia. So everybody's playing that little game, and the US is not able to break through on any issue in this because the Al-Khalifas all of a sudden look like they're the wise people in charge of stability.
Look, I think the United States doesn't frame its policies towards any of these countries in terms of Sunni versus Shia. You know, we don't have a policy towards the Sunni and a policy towards the Shia. I think what the United States would like to see is reform and sort of more equal rights for all Bahraini citizens, regardless of what sect they're in. And
yes,
I think the United States sees its role as having a partnership with Bahrain, not simply with the monarchy, as you said, Brian, but with the people of Bahrain. Right. Now, I think that I think the United States' position is that in order to best accomplish that kind of reform, meaningful reform, it's best to be a partner to Bahrain, simply rather than simply sort of being, you know, sort of on the outside, sort of criticizing or whatever the case may be, to help the monarchy, which is, you know, frankly, the government itself is not unified on these issues, but to help them move in the right direction.
I want to take a quick listen to a clip from President Obama's speech that he made on the Middle East last May.
When our short-term interests don't align perfectly with our long-term vision for the region. But we can, and we will, speak out for a set of core principles, principles that have guided our response to the events over the past 6 months. The United States opposes the use of violence and repression against the people of the region. The United States supports a set of universal rights, and these rights include free speech, the freedom of peaceful assembly, the freedom of religion, equality for men and women under the rule of law, and the right to choose your own leaders, whether you live in Baghdad or Damascus, Sana'a or Tehran.
Jean-Francois, it's an outstanding speech, but from that or from anything else we've heard from the Obama administration, can we specifically point to what the administration's human rights policy is?
Well, we haven't seen the results on the ground, as far as I can tell. There is some wishful thinking about moving towards reform, but the basic reforms have not taken place. And you still have the forces of repression in Bahrain are coming from the Al-Khalifas and some of the Sunnis extremists, and nothing on the other side. So I think it's all wishful thinking, as I said.
I mean, the bit that jumps out there is President Obama saying to people in the Middle East, you have the right to choose your own leaders. Well, they don't have the right in Bahrain. Elsewhere, later on in that speech, actually, he talks specifically about Bahrain. And I think that the May the 19th speech there was probably the high point in terms of US being publicly supportive of the democracy protesters. Because later in the speech, he says there to the Bahraini government, you can't have a real dialogue with parts of the peaceful opposition in jail. That was met with great enthusiasm by democracy activists in Bahrain. Really think that the US was now going to push the monarchy into and cajole them into some sort of negotiations, and it just didn't happen. And the US has backed off from that position over those remaining 8-9 months and hasn't said anything nearly as strong as that since.
That's right. Now, even the Sunni opposition, which is very small, but there is a strong Sunni opposition, and the leader has been in jail, and he's supposed to stay in jail for another 5 years after being tortured. It's very tricky there.
Look, I mean, I think to reiterate, the United States in recent days has spoken out on behalf of people who are being held in prison for political expression, has withheld aid, and has called upon the government to refrain from violence. And I think it's important, again, for U.S. policy. Remember, the United States is not an NGO, it's not an advocacy organization. We have to work with these governments to achieve these ends. And the question is, how can you do that meaningfully? And I think that, again, the United States wants to be a partner for the Bahraini people and for the Bahraini government, and to work towards those ends. And I think that you could see right now that yes, the United States could do more. And I think, frankly, again, the United States wasn't in a great position before these uprisings to have the kind of close relations that might be helpful right now with these Gulf states. But working with the relationship they have, I think that they have put quite a bit on the line with this particular relationship on behalf of democracy and human rights.
And it doesn't seem to have paid off very much.
So far, I think
in
that's right.
1994, we had these
gentlemen,
problems.
that is going to do it. We are out of time. I am so sorry. But thank you all for joining us. What an interesting and enlightening discussion. That's it from the Inside Story team in D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.